Okay. Hello and welcome everybody to today's program, The New Nuclear Age at the Precipice of Nuclear Armageddon. It's quite a title, with Ankit Panda. Thank you all for joining us today for the program, co-hosted with Temple University, Japan. My name's Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society. In today's conversation with Ankit Panda, who's returning to the Korea Society since pre-pandemic time. So welcome back. Glad the pandemic's over. To argue that we are now entering a third nuclear age filled with unprecedented uncertainty and risk. Ankit Panda is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has testified on matters related to South Korea and Japan before the congressionally chartered U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission. Ankit has also testified before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. Thank you for joining us today, Ankit. I should also say Ankit has been a Kimku Fellow at the Korea Society, put in a plug for our long-running Kimku program. Before we begin the conversation, I'd like to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors, the names of which are prominently displayed in the lobby, for making this program possible. I would also like to express my thanks to the Korea University SIPA Korea Focus Student Club. I think I see some of you in the audience, so 환영합니다. 나는 SIPA에서 가르치고 있습니다. So thanks for your partnership. We are welcoming your questions live. We will provide an opportunity for in-person attendees to ask questions directly. For our virtual audience, please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. Today's program is moderated by the Korea Society's Policy Director, Jonathan Corrado. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. Welcome, Ankit. Welcome back. I hope New York is going to always be your second home, and we're privileged to have you back here at the Korea Society.
Thanks a lot. It's nostalgic for me to be back here. I spent many good days and afternoons and mornings at the Korea Society back when I used to live here, so it's a pleasure to launch the book for its first event in New York City right here.
Right on. And you've inspired a lot of other Kimku Fellows to come here today, I think, because of that fellowship that you generated during that time.
Absolutely.
Congratulations. This is a tremendous book. I learned a ton, and I'm always reading about this stuff, but I think I mentioned to you, but I want to mention to them. I was reading this thing on the subway, not because I had to, but because I was genuinely interested in. And I don't normally do that because I get motion sickness, but this kept me going. So congratulations. Really great book. Let's start with the basic premise. And you argue that, I like the terminology you use here, we are slouching towards a third nuclear age. So just an opportunity for you to discuss the premise of the book. What were the first two ages and what makes this third age that we're slouching towards so dangerous?
Yeah, sure. So look, those of us who work on nuclear weapons issues for essentially the 30-year period that followed the end of the Cold War, we didn't go away, but nuclear weapons were no longer front and center in international politics in the way that they were during the Cold War. Right, so the first nuclear age was that period from 1945. I'm sure many of you saw Oppenheimer, the arrival of the bomb, the use of these weapons against Japan in the final days of the Second World War, and then the ensuing decades that marked the proliferation of nuclear weapons to the initial group of states that acquired them, the exploration of nuclear proliferation by a number of other countries, the arrival of intense nuclear crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin crisis, crises in the 1980s, near misses and accidents. This was a period when fundamentally humans, including here in the United States, were discovering what nuclear weapons meant for the enterprise of warfare. Bernard Brodie, writing in the late 1940s, observes that nuclear weapons were the absolute weapon. They transformed the very enterprise of the military instrument, because it no longer meant that countries that had these weapons would try to fight and win wars. They would be primarily concerned with preventing wars, especially with other countries that had nuclear weapons. But then the Cold War ends, and nuclear weapons don't go away, but that shadow they cast over all of humanity, this threat of Armageddon, that very dramatic word that appears in the title of my book, recedes fundamentally. The United States and Soviet Union are no longer in a intense bipolar confrontation. The new Russian Federation, of course, is transitioning. We try to secure the weapons of the former Soviet Union, repatriate them to Russia. But this was a time when the themes of the nuclear age started to shift. Proliferation in southern Asia, the Korean Peninsula, where we learned in the early 1990s that Kim Il-sung was beginning to experiment with nuclear weapons acquisition. And we transition into this broader period where we do arms control, we strengthen the global nuclear order, and we move fundamentally to a world with fewer nuclear weapons. At the height of the Cold War, we had 70,000 nuclear weapons. Today, we live in a world with 12,500. But the argument I make in the book...
Total in the world.
Total
right.
in the world. The argument I make in the book is that starting essentially towards the end of the 2010s, but really this decade, nuclear weapons are back in a very big way. They are back at the forefront of international politics in the transatlantic, where I think many of us have, of course, discussed over dinners, over drinks, over coffees, whether or not Vladimir Putin might resort to the use of nuclear weapons. Those were not conversations that many of us were having a few years ago, right, about world leaders potentially resorting to the use of nuclear weapons against a nuclear-armed transatlantic alliance. And of course, in East Asia, China is building up its nuclear forces in a way that we haven't seen in decades. Those are just two of the dynamics I discuss in the book. There's a lot more happening. Technologies are changing very quickly. Artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, new missile defense capabilities, a golden dome. All of this is, I think, creating a resurgence not only of nuclear risk, but arguably the intensification of cross-cutting sources of risk and complexity that make this third nuclear age a lot more dangerous.
So there's an aspect of deterrence that gets a little bit less discussed, but you elaborate in great detail, and you advocate for accepting some measure of vulnerability in a deterrence posture in order to get at more stability, right? To not put at threat the adversary's second strike capabilities so that they are less motivated to continue arms racing, right? And so this is maybe an argument that doesn't get put out there so much, where the conversation revolves around more deterrence, more, but you're making an argument for sometimes less can be more. But it takes two to tango here, right? So like, why do we see, whereas in the post-Cold War context, the US and Russia were very willing to engage in this sort of disarmament engagement, that's no longer the case in this third nuclear age. So what's going on here?
Yeah, sure. So this idea of vulnerability that I talk about in the book is one that, the United States and the Soviet Union get around to by the end of the 1960s. They've been through the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're both building new types of nuclear capabilities. They're also developing defenses against these weapons. This is relevant amid our current national debate here in the United States about a golden dome. And of course, at some point, there's an observation. You have the McNamara Pentagon here in the United States that really starts thinking about the relationship between offense and defense, right? So Bernard Brodie observes that nuclear weapons are the absolute weapon. They can inflict levels of damage against the countries that might suffer nuclear attacks that are completely unimaginable to anything previously seen by all mankind. And deterrence, this sort of two-way relationship between countries that possess these weapons, is at its most stable in a purely kind of academic sense when each side has the ability to retaliate no matter what happens. No matter if the other side strikes first, there will always be some capacity to retaliate, always be some capacity to inflict damage that the other side would consider unacceptable. For those of us here in this room interested in the Korean Peninsula, Kim Jong-un has been very concerned with this in the last few years, making sure that he can communicate to an American president that no matter what happens, no matter the context of a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, by choosing to push a war, by choosing to try and end the North Korean regime, they will be able to retaliate.
Thus the little James Bond rockets on the back of trains that pop up.
Sure, that's part of it, right? But this is not a fundamentally pleasant state of affairs, right? If you're an American, you don't want to live in a world where the threat of assured retaliation is something you have to live with. But of course, the argument that I make, and I think the argument that many made in the 1960s, 1970s transition towards a more towards a relationship of arms control and detente with the Soviet Union, was that to mollify the arms race, you fundamentally have to accept this, even if you don't like it. And of course, the reality, as I try to explain in the book, is that states have never really found a way to live comfortably with this. That even if this idea that accepting vulnerability with your adversary renders the nuclear balance more stable, it prevents the incentives to arms race, there is always, I think, the pull of technological change, of opportunity. Today we're having conversations, for instance, will artificial intelligence help us find all of Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons and take them out? Can we escape this condition of vulnerability? That temptation is always there. And part of, I think, finding what we might call strategic stability with our nuclear armed adversaries in this world will be sort of containing our own impulses to try and escape that condition. Because I continue to think that the bid to escape vulnerability does lead us to a place, ultimately, where the other side will do whatever it takes to make sure that they have the ability to assuredly retaliate.
Right. And it leads to a dilemma where the adversary is motivated to use it rather than lose it if they perceive that their second strike has been rendered obsolete. Now they're on a hair trigger posture, and that's not a good place to be.
Yeah, I would say that's actually a particular artifact of how we in the United States have thought about nuclear strategy. I try to explain in the book, there are varying approaches to nuclear strategy and postures among the 9 countries that today possess nuclear weapons. The United States is really interesting. I mean, we are extremely idiosyncratic in what we ask of our nuclear weapons. We ask, of course, that these weapons deter attacks against the U.S. homeland, that these weapons assure our list of allies, which is a list that is 30-plus countries today. But we also ask that if deterrence ever fails, if one of our adversaries ever uses nuclear weapons, or we believe that they might be on the cusp of using nuclear weapons, the United States harbors aspirations to limit damage against itself. And in articulating that goal, what the United States hopes to do is essentially have the ability to find and destroy the adversary's nuclear weapons. Now, as an American, that might sound like something we should all want our armed forces to aspire to. But of course, if you're Kim Jong-un, you're Vladimir Putin, you're Xi Jinping, and you're in a nuclear crisis with the United States, and you're worried that the United States, with our exquisite military capabilities, might be able to disarm you, you start having extremely strong incentives in a crisis to use your weapons early because you might lose them. So that's one of the dynamics I try to explain to a reader. I mean, this is it's a particularly arcane area of American nuclear strategy that I don't think is really, I don't think manifests in the popular imagination, where most members of the public have heard of mutually assured destruction. But that's a condition, this is a strategy, and there's an important difference between those two.
And we're going to dig more into counterforce posture and how that could lead to escalation risk in a little bit. I want to get to the particular ways in which horizontal and vertical escalation risk are increasing in the third nuclear age, and I'll quote you. You say that, quote, focusing on the traditional strategic nuclear dyads, primarily US-Russia, US-China, India-Pakistan, India-China, and US-North Korea, remains useful, but it is no longer sufficient in making sense of the increasingly interlinked nature of nuclear competition. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? So the number of nuclear weapons states hasn't changed since the second nuclear age, right? North Korea was the last arriver to the club. Kim Jong-un claimed that his deterrent was complete in 2017, becoming the 9th country to possess nuclear weapons. But whereas in the past, I think you had a much stronger case to think about many of these deterrence relationships as relationships between country A and country B, right? US and the Soviet Union, US and China, India, Pakistan, India, China. The links between these countries today, I think, are being felt a lot more strongly. Let me give you just one really concrete example. Let's go back to the Golden Dome, right? So let's say the United States in the next few years embarks on this ambitious project to build a national missile defense architecture of the kind that we've never possessed. That is going to draw a counter reaction from China, which is going to say, okay, the Americans are beefing up their missile defenses. That probably means we need more missiles and we need better missiles because we have to be able to assure damage. That is the essence of deterrence. And so China will react to the Golden Dome, as will Russia. Now, as China reacts, India isn't going to sit still. India is going to take steps to make sure that as China's capabilities improve, India can maintain its own doctrinal requirements for unacceptable damage. And in turn, Pakistan is going to react because Pakistan is primarily concerned with its nuclear deterrence relationship with India. Meanwhile, as the U.S. develops the Golden Dome and potentially beefs up its conventional military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, including in South Korea, Japan, Guam, Kim Jong-un is going to look at that and start feeling that he might need to think about adapting his forces and capabilities. And so even when we think about what I've just described, this idea that we might be able to have an arms control negotiation with, let's say, just China and address some of the bilateral differences that we have and concerns we have, that becomes a lot more difficult when you have this sort of intertwined environment, right? I didn't even bring up Russia, which has nuclear forces in its far east, in the vicinity of China and the Korean Peninsula. But I mean, I would add something here, Jonathan, which is that I make the argument in the book that if you think about the center of gravity in international politics with regard to nuclear weapons, during the first nuclear age, it was squarely in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Mm-hmm. In the North Atlantic, in the transatlantic context between North America and Russia and the Soviet Union. Today, it is squarely, I would argue, in the Pacific, where you have essentially all of the world's nuclear weapon states, with the exception of France, UK, and Israel, with some stake in the geopolitics of Asia. And so that is a fundamentally important component of this discussion, and I think it affects how, particularly the United States, how many of our allies in Asia are now thinking about the dynamics that are unfolding in that region.
And a little trailer for a future question that I'll ask, because this dynamic, one of the ways that it gets complicated is that whereas the US and Soviet Union were able to engage in strategic security dialogues, that doesn't seem to be happening so much with US and China right now.
Not at
Less
all.
interest from the Chinese side. So we'll get to that. I want to talk a little bit about strategic empathy, the importance of nuclear adversaries understanding one another's point of view in order to be able to successfully deter them. So something interesting happened is that the US was unwilling to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine because they knew that that would lead to direct confrontation against Russia. Very interesting. Joseph Stalin was unwilling to enforce a no-fly zone over the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War because he suspected that that would lead to nuclear conflict against America. So just interesting sort of historical and contemporary rhyming there, showing the restraint and showing an understanding that this kind of escalation will lead to direct risk. You wrote that it's very difficult or impossible to do this sort of strategic empathy because it's difficult or impossible to know, quote, how an act of supposedly proportionate retaliation may be interpreted in the course of war where psychological and emotional stressors will be intense on leaders, end quote. So I wonder, how can we overcome these biases and the stresses of the moment to better understand our adversaries?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I wrangle with quite a bit because I don't think it has an easy answer. It's something I think about a lot. You know, I end the book by talking about the importance of prudence in national leaders to sort of understand that, and part of the way I got there, I'll provide a little vignette into my writing process, was that I spent a lot of time rereading the transcripts of Kennedy and his executive committee during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was a group of trusted advisors around the president, helping him navigate those 13 perilous days in October 1962, where the world got closer to nuclear war than we ever have since. And it's interesting because Kennedy is not the same man, I would argue, on day one of the crisis as he is on day 11, day 12, day 13. Because on day one, you know, he is, of course, deeply disturbed by reports of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba. He recalls that in 1961, he was personally humiliated in Vienna by Soviet leader Khrushchev. He has a bone to pick. He's perceived as a youthful American leader who might not be able to go toe-to-toe with the Soviet leadership. But of course, by the end of the crisis, when it's incredibly clear what the stakes are, and it's apparent to really everybody in the XCOM, you have this fascinating dynamic where Kennedy is surrounded by a group of advisors who are trying to maximize American national interests as they are perceived at the time. And of course, we later learned, decades after the crisis, that the key to unfolding Cuba was this agreement to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Right. And you have certain advisors around Kennedy telling him, you know, don't take that deal. You're going to completely ruin our credibility with NATO and the Turks and the allies. You know, we have these core strategic interests in our long-term competition. And Kennedy, of course, is worried about the final failure, nuclear war. And he's ultimately in a place where he's able to, I think, deeply also empathize with Nikita Khrushchev, who's in a similar predicament. And there's been some really interesting archival work on the Russian side that I think fleshes out this part of the story. And ultimately, I think one of the main motivators is that fear of nuclear war. Once that fear, I think, deeply manifests within Kennedy, all of these things that we talk about in peacetime, you know, our allies, our national interests, our geostrategic goals, in how we choose to implement our grand strategy, that starts to evaporate. And the sole goal becomes, how do we prevent this from going all the way past the precipice? And I think that is a really important lesson from that crisis. And so to answer your question about how do you manifest empathy, I don't know that I have the answer, but one of the important variables, I think, is that rational fear of nuclear war. It is an entirely rational fear that guides us to this place where that mechanism of nuclear deterrence, which depends on that risk that something could get terribly out of hand, begins to deeply infuse the psychology of national leaders that essentially causes them to set aside all of these other goals that they have. It's not something that just applies to us, by the way. I think this is applied to Vladimir Putin in the way that he has prosecuted war against Ukraine. He has been cognizant of thresholds that NATO has made very clear, if they are crossed, will lead to uncertain, catastrophic consequences. And so not testing each other, I think, really does depend on that empathy, which we count on to make nuclear deterrence actually work.
And it's scary how close we've come so frequently to nuclear war when you go back and look at the history and you tell the story of the Soviet officer who decided not to respond to an incoming radar signal interception that US missiles were inbound because he had a funny feeling in his stomach. It's just remarkable how it comes down to the psychology of individual people in these most stressful moment of their lives, and we depend on them to steer us away from war. But it's, as you write, it's not guaranteed that this will continue.
No, absolutely, and those fears can manifest in many different ways. Imagine a ideologically loyal North Korean air defense officer in an intense crisis with the United States.
Yep.
Very much prone to interpreting, I think, anything entering North Korean airspace as probably an American bomber. What happens if a civilian aircraft veers into North Korean airspace in the heat of that crisis? We have no shortage of examples of civilian airliners being shot down by nervous air defense crews.
Yep.
We had that happen during the Cold War. We had it happen a few years ago after Qasem Soleimani was killed. The Iranians, I believe, shot down a Ukrainian civilian airliner as well. So those kinds of phenomena could very quickly lead to inadvertent escalation. And wars, essentially, that no side deliberately wants to invite could very easily start as a result of those kinds of accidents.
There's a really interesting story during the Nixon era how North Korea shot down a U.S. spy plane, and Nixon was drunk at the time, and he ordered the preparation for a nuclear strike. And Kissinger told the NSC and the Joint Chiefs, let's wait until he sobers up until tomorrow. And so they did, based on Kissinger's advice, and then the nuclear strike, of course, did not follow. But I mean, it's just so perilous. I want to get to another thing that could take us away from the brink, and that's that Thomas Schelling discusses the hope that a strong taboo on nuclear use will spread. But we see today that nuclear weapons are being brandished all over the world in Europe and Asia. And you write that the three nuclear-armed great powers are veering away from the stable ideal of mutually assured destruction. Can you tell us more about how this has happened?
Yeah, so look, we are now less than a year away from the end of the last strategic arms control agreement, keeping the total size of the U.S. and Russian arsenals limited. This is a new start. This treaty cannot be extended again. It was extended once by the Biden administration. There was a 5-year extension option. There's no path beyond that, right? And for the United States, there is now this perception that we are now, for the first time, in a too near peer environment, right? China is not going to be a nuclear peer of the United States, even if you read the most optimistic estimates of the U.S. intelligence community, right? It's going to be, or pessimistic, I guess, 1,500 warheads by the mid-2030s. But the United States will have to make a decision in the coming years about how to react to that environment. And there appears to be a bipartisan consensus of sorts in Washington that more warheads will be necessary for the United States. And so then you have to ask the question, if Russia and China have a certain calculation that they each have to make about what they will consider sufficient to respectively deter the United States, they will probably not find it sufficient to watch as the United States deploys more nuclear warheads to compete with both of them. Each may choose to react. And that is where we enter into a potential three-way nuclear arms race, where arms control with Russia, which nobody's optimistic about in the current environment, given that U.S.-Russia relations, albeit the events of the last 3 months, remain in a very bad place. And so the question fundamentally is, how do you stabilize this?
Yeah.
And the answer, one answer would be for the United States to completely change everything that Americans know about nuclear strategy since the 1960s and say that we will adopt a China or Russia style approach fundamentally, where we think about minimum deterrence. Again, I think that's not really an option for the United States as long as we want to have allies. American allies care deeply about what the United States says and deploys when it comes to its nuclear forces. So the answer to this question remains an open one. And one of the answers may be that China is not intending to compete longer term with the United States with its nuclear weapons. That's an assessment that I don't think is credible at the moment because there are so many questions about the intentions on the Chinese side. Xi Jinping is very much unlike Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. He doesn't give long speeches about why he's doing what he's doing with his nuclear weapons. And so in Washington, assumptions, I think, have run wild about why China is doing what it's doing. And so you have the perfect cocktail of misperceptions, I think, on all three sides for a potentially open-ended arms race. And like I said, there is no clear answer at the moment. How do you build stability with three major powers, especially when one of them, the United States, thinks that Russia and China are deeply aligned in ways that make them essentially partners in competing with the United States longer term?
So let's just take a little detour and talk about China for a second. So by 2035, what is it? 1,500 nuclear weapons it's aspiring towards. Still nominally have a no first use policy. I don't know
They
how
do, yeah.
credibly we should interpret that, right? So how do we, given this lack of clear pronouncements about nuclear doctrine from the CCP, how should we posture ourselves given this new challenge?
So I think there's something to be said for not overreacting to the China challenge, right? You have deep conventional deterrence concerns in Asia, right? I don't think it's particularly controversial that the United States is less conventionally dominant in the Indo-Pacific than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and that balance is getting worse with every preceding year. And the other thing I tell American audiences is that we don't live in a moment of limitless national resources or a limitless national defense industrial base. And so ultimately, there are trade-offs to be made. If you care about deterring a conventional conflict, deterring an invasion of Taiwan, the kinds of capabilities you need to be able to do that credibly, to communicate to the PLA, to the Communist Party leadership that an invasion is very unlikely to succeed, that actually ultimately has very little to do with American nuclear weapons, which are potentially relevant at much higher levels of escalation, but not at that starting point where a decision to invade takes place. And then there's a lot to be said for software, which is, I think, a problem that I explore in the book, but of course this was a manuscript that was finalized before November 2024. But to be very open about it, I mean, we in the United States, I think, are relitigating our grand strategy fundamentally in a way that we haven't, arguably, since the end of the Second World War. And I don't want to be ahistorical because we've had differences with our alliances. We've modified our force posture. Jimmy Carter wanted to pull troops out of Korea. Richard Nixon had his Guam doctrine where we relitigated some of the conditions under which we might aid our allies. But we've never fundamentally had this moment where the United States might be viewing its foreign commitments to allies, as being liabilities rather than assets for American global power. And so all of that, I think, really has to shape the context in which Congress in particular has to decide what will we fund as a country going forward. And then there's also kind of more nuts and bolts issues that I could talk about. During the Cold War, we actually had a very warm production line for nuclear weapons. Today, we have a non-deployed nuclear stockpile that could be redeployed on submarines and ICBMs. But once you do that, you have to ask if China and Russia react. The United States is actually very poorly positioned to engage in an arms race, which wasn't true during the Cold War. And that gave us the ability to actually competitively react to the Soviet Union. So it's a really tough problem. But I do think the way to get this right is to, don't panic, as Douglas Adams reminded us, and I think take into account the realities of American resource constraints, of our domestic politics, of the ways in which American grand strategy may be shifting. And if you asked me, I mean, my concern would primarily be conventional capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, because ultimately I do think American nuclear weapons remain sufficient, credible, effective, in a way that will continue to contribute to central deterrence.
I did not have Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quotation on my bingo card for today, so thank you.
That's actually going to be the epigram to the whole book now.
So let's go to extended deterrence because you brought it up, right? And so historically, West Germany was satisfied with nuclear sharing, whereas France and de Gaulle famously said, will you really trade New York for Paris? So right now, a lot of anxiety about extended deterrence. What do you think the long-term prospects are? And particularly the case of South Korea, I think is instructive here.
Well, the conversation I've been having a lot in the last few months is maybe we're all about to find out that the French were right all along. I hope that's not true. But the observation there, of course, is that, use the word satisfied, which I think is actually a pretty strong word for extended deterrence, because allies have always been willing to tolerate certain forms of American reassurance, but a full sense of satisfaction I don't think has ever really been achieved. Assurance is this never-ending task for the United States. It's fundamentally an extremely difficult thing to do because you're communicating to a list of 30-plus countries around the world that the President of the United States would be willing to use the full range of American military capabilities to defend them against nuclear attack and strategic non-nuclear attacks, anything that would be existential to their countries. And if you dig deeper into what that commitment means, it means that the President of the United States would be willing to risk nuclear war on the behalf of a country that he or she may never have been to, right? We have countries in NATO, for instance, which is a large alliance of 31 allies of the United States that many American presidents have never even visited, probably have no personal stakes in. And so reassuring these countries that that promise remains credible requires incredible feats of both hardware and software. And of course, on the Korean Peninsula, we face, I think, a particularly acute challenge where, very understandably, if you are a strategic elite in South Korea and you're looking at your region, that region I described earlier, you are surrounded not just by Kim Jong-un, who repeatedly threatens to use nuclear weapons against your territory, but by a China that's building up, by a Russia that invaded its neighbor in Europe, that is now in an alliance with North Korea. Insecurity is extremely high. And so the demands for assurance continue to grow. And let's get back to that question of American grand strategy, because that matters too, right? The reason the United States has a system of alliances is partly out of an interest in non-proliferation, right? In 1964, under President Johnson, we convened the Gilpatrick Committee to review the consequences of the spread of nuclear weapons after China tested the bomb in October 1964. And one of the things that committee came back with to President Johnson was a really important observation that a world with more centers of nuclear decision-making, be they friendly, be they unfriendly, didn't matter. It was just a much more dangerous world for American interests. It didn't matter if you had a world full of Frances, right? We got along with de Gaulle. We got along with the French, even if we had differences on extended deterrence. It didn't matter if it was a world full of, Iran's, North Korea's, or France and Germany's. We just didn't want to live in a world with more nuclear armed powers. And today, I think that assumption, which has guided decades of American thinking on extended deterrence, on non-proliferation, is no longer as strong as it used to be. It is not too uncommon to hear Americans make the case that would it be so bad if South Korea, if Japan, allies, democracies, countries with very close economic, people-to-people ties with the United States acquired nuclear weapons? And so that fundamental litigation that's now happening in Washington, I think, in a way, should compel us to revisit the reasons that the Gilpatrick Committee made the conclusions it did, because I think many of those conclusions do remain relevant. And of course, as we see with the history of nuclear proliferation, it is exceptionally difficult to reverse the acquisition of nuclear weapons. Only one country has done it, South Africa, under conditions of essentially regime change, the end of apartheid. But that is, I think, a debate that will continue to percolate in Washington.
And certainly the entrapment fears that would follow on from Allied proliferation are something that's worth considering as we look at this.
Exactly. We've never wanted to have nuclear-armed allies that start nuclear wars that the United States is then drawn in to finish, right? And that was a concern with France, specifically during the Cold War. It would likely manifest in Northeast Asia with South Korea, with Japan. So very much, I think, a lot to learn from the history. And I think that's a through line in this talk so far, right? I mean, one of the benefits that we have from having lived through the first and second nuclear ages is that as we enter this more uncertain period that I've described, we can actually take away a lot of enduring wisdom from those particular earlier periods. And, things are different. Geopolitics is different today. Technology is different today. But the book is not breathless about the fact that everything is new. There is actually a lot that is the return of old problems, where turning to that older wisdom that I think we developed during the Cold War continues to have enduring value.
So one of those old solutions to an old problem is arms control. And you talk about how JFK famously mused that there could be 25 nuclear-armed countries by the mid-'70s. So what if he was wrong about the timing, but right about the number of countries? And why is arms control, why has it lost its traction?
So arms control and non-proliferation have broadly played a really important part in particularly mollifying that period that followed the end of the Cold War. And of course, one of the observations that I think is unavoidable is that arms control manifests under one extremely important condition, which is mutual interest. And so you've had many people in Washington over the last 5 to 10 years convene endless seminars and meetings and write multiple papers about how we could do arms control. I've been one of those people, right? I've written articles about how we do North Korea arms control, right? The problem is political, right? If you don't have, I think you said earlier, it takes two to tango. That is very much true of arms control. It wasn't that story I told about the 1960s was this kind of organic process where one day the Soviet leadership woke up and the American leadership woke up and they discovered an interest in arms control. It was more that as they sort of thought about the costs of the arms race, the consequences of the arms race, what it would mean for the potential conditions under which wars might break out, and of course the consequences of a war. Those were three of the traditional rationales that led rational leaders, out of their own self-interest in mitigating the cost of an endless competition, to engage in arms control. And today we just don't have that. We don't have that fear that allowing the current situation to fester will irreversibly harm our national interest in the United States, Chinese national interests, Russian national interests. But of course, we might start heading in that direction again, right? If we are at the start of this new nuclear age, and this book ends up, hopefully, I mean, I would hope that the book's argument is actually wrong, but if it is right, and the states do engage in this arms race, then we do end up in a world where some of those conditions will, I think, start to manifest for good, rational reasons. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that everything I described earlier about multipolarity, those interlinkages, makes doing arms control a lot more complicated. Because you can't just, you're not sitting down with one country, right? I would argue there's still a very compelling reason to sit down with the Russians, because the United States and Russia still control the vast majority of the world's nuclear weapons. But of course, you have new technologies, new pathways.
Can we just do a brief inventory? How many nuclear weapons do we think each country has? I know there's a tremendous detour, but it's very interesting to me. So
the U.S. and Russia have about 4,500 to 5,000 each. China is about 700 as of the last U.S. Intelligence estimates. The French are about 290. The Brits are about 230-ish, 225-ish, I think. India and Pakistan in the upper 100s. North Korea, endlessly debated, but probably in the range of around 80 to 100 warheads today.
Israel,
and of course,
do we know?
Israel, hotly debated, but in the range of probably low hundreds.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, and of course, each of these little dyads will be motivated to arms race and just maintain pace with one another.
Well, yes and no, because, I mean, there are ultimately limitations, right? For a country like India, for instance, acquiring or amassing large amounts of fissile material for use in nuclear weapons is not something that's to be taken lightly. So they might be compelled to qualitatively compete as well. The technology piece, which I was getting to, I mean, I think matters quite a bit too, because we are also in a world now where many non-nuclear military technologies and even non-nuclear civilian technologies, interact with matters of warfare, matters of the that pertain to the nuclear balance. And so the Cold War was, in a way, I mean, I don't want to use the term simple, but at least from an arms control perspective, when only nuclear weapons could threaten other nuclear weapons, and you could count nuclear weapons on each side, and you could derive these principles of parity that would lead both sides to essentially decide that they could live with a certain arrangement that would render deterrence stable. We don't really have that today.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about arms control in new ways. Ultimately, you might have to tolerate more risk when it comes to even verifying certain capabilities, right? Before the Biden administration left office, they actually did get somewhere with China, which was this handshake agreement on artificial intelligence, keeping artificial intelligence out from the decision to use nuclear weapons, right? A good thing for the U.S. and China to agree on. But, I mean, let's say, that started to get blowback here in the United States, and people ask, how are you going to verify that? How are you going to verify that China is actually doing that? Well, the answer is you don't. There's not a really easy way to do that. You're not flying people over to count a certain number of warheads or to verify that warheads are not in this particular place where they've said they're not. That's the kind of stuff you can do pretty easily. So I offer some ideas in the book about how to get around all these problems, right? There are technical solutions here, but a lot of this does come down to politics. It comes down to how much risk we're willing to tolerate, which in a way is really every disagreement that exists in the field of nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy is a conversation about risk. And the reason we have disagreements is because people have fundamentally different levels of risk they're willing to tolerate. And so for American planners in the Department of Defense, traditional American approaches to arms control have been extremely conservative about tolerating risk. And that may have to shift if we are to get anywhere in a future arms control negotiation.
Classic prisoner's dilemma, right? You're well off if both prisoners agree to not rat each other out. But the best possible situation is you rat the other guy out, and then you lie to him and convince him that you're not going to, right? And the same is true for arms control. And so often verification has been the issue at which these engagements, particularly in the Korean Peninsula, have broken down. Just that the difficulty of the actual feasibility of conducting the verification in a way that is satisfactory is just so challenging.
Yeah, I mean, like a few years ago, I wrote a report on verifying an arms control agreement with North Korea, which was really fascinating because we turned to all these new technologies where, we're all realistic. North Korea is not going to allow American boots on the ground to go crawl around their ICBM bases. So how do you start thinking about using, satellite technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, and other things to start making some of these ideas more credible. And the thing is, I mean, during the Cold War, it was a tough effort to actually sell members of Congress on, why some of these arms control treaties, which of course needed the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate, were in the American national interest. How do you trust the other side? And so you will, if we get to that place, you are going to need ultimately, I think, an American executive branch that is willing to, A, recognize that arms control can suit American interests, B, have a theory of verification that they are willing to sell to a skeptical Congress. I mean, look, everybody is going to be meaningfully skeptical about doing diplomacy with these countries that we fundamentally have very strong differences with. But that was, of course, true during the Cold War when we did arms control with the Soviets, even if doing arms control didn't end the Cold War.
This is maybe my hardest question because we've done entire programs with you on this one question, which is nuclear risk on the Korean Peninsula, 5 to 10 years. What should we be most concerned about? And I'll prime you with one thought, which is Marcus Skarlaskis from the Atlantic Council has argued that deterrence by denial is more effective than deterrence by punishment and less inflammatory as one way to address things on the peninsula. So just intended to prime you.
Yeah, I mean, so the denial argument makes a lot of sense, but I think it's a very difficult one to sell to the South Korean people. Because what denial means is being tolerant of sustaining military operations and economic life in a nuclear war. And of course, I think it's an argument that's easier for Americans to make. But of course, if you're on the Korean Peninsula, denial might mean that if Kim Jong-un uses a nuclear weapon, you fight through it, which the alliance is planning to do. There are efforts. U.S. and ROK have now for about, I think, going up on almost 8 years, been carrying out military exercises simulating the use of North Korean nuclear weapons against South Korea, making sure that the ROK and U.S. armed forces are able to continue military operations. But that's an unsettling recommendation for a citizen of Seoul to hear. And so then, of course, you get the logical counter argument, which is that it has to be about punishment. It has to be about disarming Kim Jong-un, which takes us back to that discussion we had earlier about why that gives Kim Jong-un very strong incentives to then go big. So, I mean, these are tough questions. Ultimately, I think ambiguity and uncertainty have tremendous value. And you also have to ask, what does Kim Jong-un want, right? This goes back to our discussion about psychology, strategic empathy. I think the unification policy change in North Korea has imbued some of these conversations with a new degree of uncertainty about, Kim considers South Korea a hostile second country now, not a part of North Korean territory under a puppet regime, so to speak. And does that actually potentially present some opportunities to get towards something resembling coexistence? I don't want to use the peaceful coexistence term from the Cold War, which has quite a bit of baggage, but something like stable coexistence. Can the two Koreas find a stable status quo that mollifies some of these risks? And then the 5 to 10 year question. So look, one thing I'll say that might be a little controversial is that, of course, a lot of what Kim Jong-un has done in the last 5 years, he's about to end a 5-year plan of military modernization, is extremely worrying, right? He's building tactical nuclear weapons. He has more nuclear warheads than he's ever had. But in a way, compared to where he was in 2017 and 2018, where you and I lived through that crisis as analysts, there was a discussion about whether the United States would strike. In a way, Kim is a lot more confident today. He's more confident that his nuclear weapons are survivable. He's probably more confident about his command and control systems, the central nervous system of any nuclear force. And what that actually means is that those incentives, where Kim is incentivized to use his nuclear weapons because he worries that he might lose them either to a kinetic attack from the US and ROK or to a cyber attack, those incentives, I think, have been mitigated because Kim is more confident, right? So in a roundabout way, that actually closes off some of those pathways to nuclear war we might have imagined with North Korea in 2017.
But perhaps presents an opportunity for him to conventionally provoke because he's confident.
That's the thing. It may lead him to take greater risks, and he is taking greater risks, right? We have North Korean troops fighting in Europe. Kim has just come clean about that. So a lot of that is very unsettling. And then the other part of nuclear risk on the Korean Peninsula, of course, does take us to the very public and very well-known debate at this point that 70% plus of the South Korean public and many strategic elites in South Korea want nuclear weapons of their own because of the discussion we've just had about the reliability of the United States. And setting aside the issue of whether or not South Korea should build a bomb, I mean, if South Korea does ever make that decision, that really does open up a lot of extremely dangerous pathways to a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Essentially, the logic being one of preventive war for North Korea and potentially other states in the region. South Korea does not have an industrial scale uranium enrichment or plutonium reprocessing capability. Those facilities would need to be built. Those facilities would be vulnerable to attack. There would be extremely strong incentives for North Korea to potentially interfere with that. So all of those uncertainties, I actually think, are a really big part of why for Seoul in the short term, no matter how bitter things might get with the United States, and I suspect they will get worse in the coming months, the best option ahead, the option with the least amount of uncertainty and risk associated with it, will be to try and continue to sustain this alliance that has survived for decades and has suited the mutual interests of the United States and South Korea. But of course, the debate on proliferation, I do think, will continue to persist. And until we, hopefully we never get there, but if we ever get to a point where there is a test of the alliance and the United States fails ultimately to fulfill its longstanding promise to South Korea, that will, I think, be a breaking point.
Inviting our audience to ask questions. So we'll line up and then I'll invite you to come to the podium. Please keep your questions question-like and identify yourself in just one question so we can get to lots of folks. So please go ahead and line up right here if you have a question. And I'll just ask you one final thing, which is anything we didn't cover, any final pitch for the book. It's wonderful. You guys should all buy it and read it because I learned a tremendous amount. But anything that we didn't cover that you think is important?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say, this has been a fairly downbeat conversation, but I do want to promise people that if you read the book, the final chapter does offer, I think, ideally a call to action, right? I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book was that observation I made at the start, which was in the post-Cold War period, people working on nuclear strategy were, at best thought of as dinosaurs and at worst thought of as completely irrelevant. But that hasn't been true for the last 5 to 10 years because of many of these issues. But the argument that I'd more broadly make is that there was once a time in the United States where members of the general public, members of Congress, anybody that worked in a national security job in Washington knew quite a bit about nuclear strategy. They weren't all experts, but people thought about nuclear war. They thought about nuclear deterrence, about stability, about the role of crises and technologies. There was coverage in the front page of major newspapers about these debates that were playing out in Washington.
Drills in classrooms.
Yeah, and I suspect we will be heading back to that world. And so my hope is that this book provides a resource for anybody looking to get themselves up to speed on why those of us who have lived in this world of arcane nuclear strategy issues are so concerned that things are getting a lot more dangerous.
Very good. Thank you so much. Okay. I saw you had a question and Robert had a question. Please go on up to the podium.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, School of International Public Affairs from Russia. And I had a question about AI. You touched upon it a little bit about technological improvement. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the benefits and potential risks of utilizing artificial intelligence, maybe even like in the US government or other governments, because inevitably we are getting there. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you're right. Inevitable is a good way to think about the ways in which AI is going to integrate with military systems, nuclear command and control. It always sounds very scary when I say that because I think people immediately go to the Terminator scenario where AI is going to be launching nuclear warheads. The good news is I don't think anybody in any nuclear armed country has any level of rational self-interest in doing that. The closest would actually be the North Koreans, who in September 2022 said that they have an interest in having the option to automatically launch nuclear weapons if Kim Jong-un is killed, but even that I think would be undesirable for Kim Jong-un for a variety of reasons. The most interesting question for me with AI is actually about how AI is going to affect the perceptions of nuclear states that their forces are going to be a lot more vulnerable, right? So let's say, we, like I talked about earlier, the United States has had this long and enduring interest in using extremely impressive space-based optical and other types of satellites to track the nuclear forces and military capabilities of other countries to sustain military operations. So if you're North Korea and you start to think, okay, so Americans used to have to send the images they collected to analysts at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and then those analysts would have to crunch those images to understand what we were doing. Let's say AI now lets the Americans do that in 5 seconds in real time. That makes me feel like I can't keep my nuclear weapons safe and secure and hidden in the course of a crisis. So if that perception, and the perception doesn't have to match the reality, because in reality I actually think that's a extremely tall order still. But if that perception manifests, you actually start getting into a much more dangerous world. And you could start applying that then to even nuclear-armed submarines, which are the most survivable basing mode for most nuclear states. If they start to think that, let's say, the United States starts seeing China deploy underwater autonomous drones in the thousands armed with AI-seeking capabilities, if that makes us feel that our nuclear-armed submarines aren't likely to be very survivable, that's also bad. So those are, I think, some of the most interesting questions. Research is still totally open and ongoing here because the technology is advancing very quickly. But again, I make that distinction between the actual state of the technology and the perception regarding what effect technological change will have on the nuclear balance. Because to go back to the missile defense conversation, we've now lived in a world where American missile defense capabilities, homeland defense capabilities, actually haven't been all that effective in reality, but they've, of course, prompted an extremely strong reaction from American adversaries who feel like they have to be able to compete. So that's just one slice. I could say a lot more about the AI nuclear nexus issue. There's decision support about how militaries and leaders will look to AI systems to advise them to cut through the fog of war, through the tremendous uncertainty that is an inherent condition that we all face in times of war and conflict, how AI could aid in adaptive planning, which is once you enter a crisis, you probably don't have a military plan that you take off the shelf that exactly matches the crisis you're in, so you have to adapt your military plans. There I actually think AI might present some opportunities that could be useful in avoiding unnecessary escalation. So the answer, as I think I say in the book, is that it depends, but there are ways in which I think managing this nexus and marriage of nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, which is going to happen, is going to require, I think, a really heroic effort of talent from really both of these worlds. And some of that is starting to happen, but there will need to be a lot more of that going forward.
And this digs into one of the really fascinating through lines of the book, which is that perception of capabilities and intention sometimes matters even more than the actual intention and capabilities. Yeah. Robert, priming you to come on up.
Thank you very much. Ankit, I just ordered the book, so thanks a lot. I won't ask you about mineshaft gaps, but I'm going to ask you about lessons from Ukraine. If you're South Korea, if you're Taiwan, if you're any country that's facing a large threat, is a lesson of Ukraine that if Ukraine had been a nuclear capable state, Putin would not have invaded it? And if so, is a lesson that one should acquire nuclear weapons?
Sure, thank you. No, that's a great question, right? So we haven't talked about this, but this comes up a lot when I talk about the book, which is Ukraine's experience in 1994, when Ukraine made the decision to relinquish nuclear weapons that were on its territory. Notice I didn't say nuclear weapons that were a deterrent for Ukraine, because there are extremely authoritative sources from the U.S. Defense Threat Reduction Agency that very clearly make the point that Ukraine did not control those weapons, right? And so if the U.S. Air Force accidentally delivers a nuclear weapon into my backyard tomorrow, I have a nuclear weapon in my backyard. I do not have a nuclear deterrent of any kind because I cannot detonate or use that nuclear weapon. So it's an important distinction. There's also been really good historical work just in the last few years that shows that the Ukrainians had some pretty intense debates. They did have the option of deciding to either crack open those weapons, remove the material, and machine them into their own nuclear weapons, or to try to gain control of those weapons based on the information that Ukrainian leaders had in the mid-1990s. The only path that made sense was for Ukraine to return those weapons to Russia and become a member of the international community in good standing rather than a nuclear pariah. That said, one of the lessons from this war is that nuclear deterrence ultimately, and I make this case in the book, it works. It provides important thresholds. It also introduces new sources of danger. Nuclear deterrence has both aided and frustrated NATO and Russia, right? For NATO, it has allowed the ability to supply Ukraine. Material has gone into Ukraine from Poland and Romania, NATO states. Their territory has not been struck by Russia deliberately. Similarly, for Russia, nuclear deterrence has worked because it's kept NATO from imposing a no-fly zone or putting boots on the ground for the moment. But of course, despite benefiting from nuclear deterrence, neither NATO nor Russia has been able to fully accomplish its objectives. And we've debated this endlessly in the West. Why can't we do more to help Ukraine? And as somebody incredibly sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, it's a constant struggle to understand what are the ways in which we can push Russian red lines. One of the really interesting lessons from this war, of course, is the effectiveness of salami slicing, right? Because the kinds of assistance that were going into Ukraine by, let's say, mid-2023 were considered to be completely unthinkably escalatory at the start of 2022. But of course, as we slowly tested the Russians and determined that the Russians were not going to react in an overwhelmingly escalatory way, we got to a point where we were sending HIMARS missile systems, increasing the range of those missiles, providing air support, intelligence support, so on and so forth. I will say this, despite these kind of, that was a very kind of, that was an answer that got at a lot of the limitations of deterrence. What I will say, though, is going to be the greatest pull of nuclear weapons is going to be what they can do for existential insurance, right? And I think that is ultimately the thing that nuclear weapons do best, is that they are arguably the most efficient way for a country, particularly a resource-constrained country, to protect itself from existential threats. Because it is very credible to threaten the use of nuclear weapons when the existence of your state is under question. It is far less credible to threaten the use of nuclear weapons in the service of territorial conquest, in the service of assisting an ally. And so the credibility combined with the capability does make that the most appealing. But of course, that brings us back to, you invoke South Korea, you invoke Taiwan. In my interactions with those who make the case for why South Korea needs nuclear weapons, it's not just that South Korea is concerned about the existential scenario. For instance, I think it's incredibly credible that if Seoul was hit with a nuclear weapon, the United States would react with a nuclear weapon, right? But we don't say that in peacetime. We don't unequivocally say that. It's about everything else that happens below that threshold. All of the unpleasantness that comes with having a country like China or North Korea for a neighbor that is threatening to attack and invade your territory, interfering with your economy, carrying out limited attacks. And nuclear weapons don't do a very good job of solving those problems. So again, I think that shapes the way in which these countries will have to think about the opportunities and pitfalls of nuclear proliferation.
So let's get to Andrew and Sue back to back so that we could get them both in there. So please, extra brief so that we can cover it within time. Andrew, over to you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Andrew, also a graduate student in Columbia. My question is about cyber capabilities. In 2010, the alleged Stuxnet operational Olympic Games that allegedly shut down the Iranian centrifuges. And so I was wondering, on that same vein, how do you see that affecting arms control negotiations for countries that might question the credibility of countries seeking to negotiate arms control?
Very good. Okay, question one on Stuxnet and cyber.
Hi, thank you. A moment that's sort of flown under the radar of this very noisy, headline-driven new administration is President Trump has said, too many nuclear weapons in the world, we should draw down, the Russians should draw down, China should draw down, we should all get to a table and negotiate that. So if you were scripting the movie of how this actually comes to be, what should happen next? Thanks.
Once again, Sue, just delivering with a great question.
Yeah, these are terrific questions, and I'm worried I'm not going to do them.
Andrew, too.
I'm not going to do them justice with the limited amount of time we have. Cyber is really tricky for so many reasons. You usually, not to get into the cybersecurity discussion, but zero-day exploits that by definition are not known to you before they are used against you, are really bad from the perspective of what we think about with nuclear weapons, right? Those are the kinds of things, and we saw this recently with the U.S. discovery of the Volt Typhoon breach of our critical infrastructure by China. Those are precisely the things that adversaries exploit in peacetime and use in a time of war. And if those kinds of intrusions occur into nationally critical nuclear systems or military command and control systems, they can be incredibly escalatory. And then you asked about arms control in cyber, very difficult to do. You get behavioral agreements, an agreement, let's say, that we won't interfere in the command and control of other nuclear states. That's a really good thing to say publicly, but again, who's going to believe you? It kind of gets back into some of the problems we hear in debates about no first use, for instance, that it's very difficult to make that credible. So really important. Again, a lot more to say, but I'll be brief. And then the question about Trump and arms control, or what he calls denuclearization, is, I think, an important one, right? I mean, Donald Trump is not a very traditional thinker about many issues, but actually when he articulates the case for arms control as being based around a perception that nuclear weapons cost a lot, he's actually getting at a very traditional argument for arms control, which is that in the Cold War, states had a very rational interest in bounding the arms race because we just didn't want to spend so much money on these weapons that were ultimately insurance for a day that we all hope will never come. And so there is something there. I think the problem is still that in order to do arms control, you need expertise, you need a process, you need a very clear articulation of what you want and want to not give up. I would not be surprised, by the way. I've talked about how New START is expiring next year. I would not be surprised if we end up with something resembling arms control coming out of the United States and Russia. It won't be a long, painfully negotiated treaty with very clear verification provisions, but it may be something that allows Donald Trump to say something that he, in 1984, said was a life dream of his. He tells the New York Times in 1984 that he has a dream to negotiate an arms control agreement in his life. And so if that is still true, and I don't know if it's still true for him, we might ultimately see something. And that could have the effect of providing something of a framework to move ahead, but it won't ultimately resolve the many sources of difference that continue to exist between the US and Russia. And bringing China in, I think, is essentially going to be impossible in the next few years.
Thank you so much, Ankit. Tremendous job. Please help me to give Ankit a warm round of applause. Congratulations. Really excellent book. So many people to thank. Peter and Bradley for making this possible. Chelsea, Nabiha, Anton, wonderful job. Thank you so much. Our president, Tom, for supporting us. We are so grateful for you for coming in-person events, and we're trying to build a community here at the Korea Society. So please hang out, have some dumplings, relax, talk to Ankit. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question to him during the session, now's your opportunity. You'd all come flock around and just hound him. That would make me so happy to see. Please consider joining the Korea Society as a member. Memberships are only $50. It's very reasonable. And it just kind of means that you're buying into what we're doing here, and we get you involved in all kinds of fun stuff and unique opportunities that you don't have as a non-member. So if you are interested, please talk to Chelsea in the back. Chelsea, hi. She's going to hook you up and help you out. Membership, yeah, you should do it. Thanks so much. We really appreciate you for coming out today. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here May 16th with Joan Cho talking about the authoritarian roots of South Korea's democracy. Really interesting book and great discussion then. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Crushed it. Well done.